The bidding had barely begun when the silence broke, not with money, but with memory. An old man in a faded coat stood in pointed voice steady as a mountain. "That dog's not for sale, he's mine." People turned confused. To them it was just another washed-up service dog no one wanted. But to Eldon McCrae it was a ghost returned on 4 legs, breathing and waiting. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The afternoon sky over Twin Pines, Colorado stretched wide and pale, a dusty watercolor wash of blue and white. A faint chill carried through the autumn air, even as sunlight pressed through drifting clouds. The wind smelled faintly of pine and dry hay. Nestled between 2 slopes of the Rocky Mountains, the town of Twin Pines was a place of whispered wealth and quiet power, where fortunes were exchanged in silence and the mountains themselves seemed to watch. At the edge of town stood the Baxter Estate Arena, a sprawling auction ground surrounded by picket fences and polished paddocks. That day, it was lit by towering floodlights even in daylight, casting sharp glints off luxury vehicles parked in rows. Inside the arena hummed with anticipation and money. Well-dressed buyers lounged in premium leather chairs, tapping glossy catalogs, their voices low, their eyes sharp with calculation. One of them was Troy Marston, mid-40s, with a square jaw, and salt-and-pepper hair draped in a charcoal blazer and snakeskin boots. A ranch investor from Texas, Troy was known for flipping show horses and hunting dogs with the same cold efficiency as real estate. He smiled only when numbers rose. A few rows behind him sat Camilla Hargrove, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair swept into a tight chignon, wearing a tailored lavender coat. A retired breeder of competition Labradors. Camilla rarely bid anymore, just watched with a nostalgic glint, her eyes constantly narrowing in judgment. At the center of it all stood Finch, a 6-year-old golden retriever. Finch's coat was a rich caramel gold, dull with dust, but still carrying a natural gleam beneath the grime. His frame was sturdy, well-muscled, with a slight stiffness in the back left leg, a faint limp that spoke of an old injury. But his eyes were what made the air shift. They were deep amber, rimmed with softness and sadness. And when he looked at the crowd, it was not with fear, but with something quieter, like someone who already knew he wouldn't be chosen. The auctioneer, Mick Ellison, a ruddy-faced man in his 50s with thinning hair and a navy blue vest, struck his gavel on the polished podium with crisp professionalism. Next, he announced, "Lot 42, male, 6 years, golden retriever, former working canine retired, pure lineage." The murmuring slowed. Eyes dropped. Fans that had been idly waving stopped mid-motion. Finch walked into the center of the sandy ring, led by a lanky young handler with earbuds in his ears, and no interest in the process. The handler unclipped Finch and walked off. Silence followed. Finch stood perfectly still. Camilla shifted in her seat. Troy glanced at his catalog and flipped past the page. Mick cleared his throat. Opening bid at $100. No hands. The crowd stirred uncomfortably. The dog wasn't aggressive, wasn't scarred, wasn't feral. He just stood there like a statue, ears twitching slightly as if he could hear the rejection forming in the air around him. From the back corner of the arena, someone stood. Eldon McCrae. 68, tall and wiry, wore a tan work coat over denim with a faded green wool scarf wrapped once around his neck. His boots were scuffed but well-maintained. A gray beard hugged his jaw, and his weathered face bore the marks of years spent outdoors, creased, calm, unreadable. There was something slow and deliberate in the way he moved, like a man who had nothing to prove and no interest in hurrying. Eldon raised one hand and said simply, "I'll take him." The entire section turned. Camilla lifted her brow. Troy smirked. Mick blinked. "Sold," he announced almost in confusion, and dropped the gavel. The deal was done. Eldon walked down the steps and across the arena floor. His gait was steady, but he paused when he reached Finch. The dog didn't back away. Instead, Finch looked up at him, those amber eyes locking with his, as if time paused for a second. Eldon exhaled. He didn't know why, but something in his chest ached in that instant. A slow, cold ache that wasn't fear and wasn't memory, but lived somewhere between. He took the leash gently, and Finch followed without hesitation. Outside the auction barn, the sun had started to dip behind the ridge. The wind had picked up, and the smell of sagebrush and distant snow mingled with the scent of livestock and diesel. Eldon walked Finch to the edge of the lot, where his old 1971 Ford pickup, rusted in places, but still growling strong, was parked with a modest, dented dog trailer attached. He opened the rear gate. Finch stepped up into the trailer without so much as a pause. Then he turned and sat quietly inside, staring back. The mountains loomed in the background. The road to Granite Hollow stretched west, winding through the woods like a path into forgotten memory. Eldon climbed into the truck, started the engine, and for a moment just sat there, hands on the wheel, heart beating too fast for a man his age. It wasn't the dog's eyes that haunted him. It was the feeling that he'd looked into them once before. The road to Granite Hollow twisted through the mountains like a half-forgotten melody. Evening light spilled across the winding gravel, bathing the tall pines in shades of amber and rust. Eldon McCrae's old Ford rattled gently as he descended the final ridge, the dog trailer behind him, creaking with every turn. Inside, Finch sat silently facing forward, as if he too knew the road. Granite Hollow wasn't a town so much as a scattering of lives stitched into a forest valley. The McCrae place lay on the eastern edge, past the post office, past the general store, and a good mile beyond where the asphalt gave up. The land was modest. 6 acres of thinning pine, a crumbling barn, a chicken coop half-eaten by moss, and a weathered A-framed cabin that seemed to lean into the wind like an old man with stories no one wanted to hear. Eldon parked by the barn and stepped out. The wind had quieted now, and the dusk wrapped the hollow in a soft hush. He walked to the back of the trailer and opened the gate. Finch looked at him for a long moment, then stood and hopped down with surprising grace for a dog his age. His nose lifted immediately, scanning the air. He took 2 steps forward, then stopped. His head-turned eyes locked on the cabin porch. There, just under the edge of the deck, was a worn patch of earth, still faintly indented. It had been 7 years, but the shape remained the resting place of a dog Eldon once loved like a son. Ranger. Eldon watched as Finch walked directly to the spot. He didn't sniff. He didn't dig. He just curled into the hollow and lay down as if he'd never left it. Eldon's breath caught. He had not told Finch where to go, had not guided him. But the dog moved like he had lived this moment before. That night, Eldon couldn't sleep. He lay in the old twin bed under the eaves, the roof creaking gently with the night breeze. Memories long buried began surfacing, the sound of paws on wood floors, the echo of training commands in fields now overgrown, the final night when the call came, in an ambush, a blast, and nothing more. They told him Ranger had died instantly. They sent a folded flag. He buried an empty collar beneath the porch. Now, a dog with the same eyes and same gait was curled in that same space. By morning, the sun sliced through the cabin windows in long, golden lines. Eldon stepped outside, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. Finch was already awake, sitting on the porch, ears, perked eyes scanning the tree line. He looked alert, but not afraid. The wind ruffled his fur. He turned briefly to look at Eldon, then resumed his quiet vigil. Across the gravel path, a screen door slammed. From the neighboring house, a sagging colonial with chipping green paint and ivy curling up the posts, emerged a girl no older than 8. She had tangled blonde curls that hadn't seen a comb in days, a red hoodie, 2 sizes too big, and mismatched boots. She moved like someone used to being invisible. Maisie Quinn. She was the daughter of Jack Quinn, a pipeline mechanic who spent most months on the road and left her in the care of his late wife's sister, who had since moved away. Maisie lived alone much of the time. The neighbors gossiped, but no one acted. Eldon had seen her before, peeking from windows, riding her bike in the dark, talking to herself in the yard. Maisie spotted Finch immediately. She didn't wave. She just stopped at the edge of her porch and crouched slowly. Finch's ears twitched. He rose, stretched, and trotted over, calm and sure. He stopped 3 feet from her and sat. Maisie reached out tentatively, her hand small and pale. Finch didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head gently, letting her touch his ears. Maisie smiled, not wide, not bright, but the kind of smile that comes after waiting a very long time to be seen. Eldon stood still. Something about the moment made him hesitate. He cleared his throat and walked over. Maisie looked up but didn't back away. Her eyes were greenish-gray, rimmed with the fatigue of someone who hadn't been read to sleep in years. "He's new," she said simply. "Yeah," Eldon replied. "Just brought him home. What's his name? I call him Finch." Maisie nodded as if she'd already known. She didn't ask to keep him. She just sat beside him on the ground, leaning against his side. Finch didn't move. For the rest of the morning, Finch stayed near the Quinn house. He paced the porch, lay in the yard, and barked once when a delivery truck came too close to the driveway. Eldon watched it all from his window. Finch hadn't done that at his own home. He hadn't stood guard. But here he acted like a sentry, as if something in him recognized that Maisie needed protecting. That evening, as clouds rolled low over the trees and dusk fell blue, Eldon knelt beside Finch near the woodpile. "You knew where to lay last night," he murmured, brushing his hand through the thick fur behind Finch's ears. "You move like Ranger. You watch like him. You even sleep on your side like he did." Finch didn't respond, of course, but he leaned into Eldon's hand, warm and still. Then, without prompting, Eldon gave a short, sharp whistle. A specific 1-2 notes, long short the one he'd trained a ranger to follow in crowds. Finch's ears lifted. He stood immediately and walked a perfect heel to Eldon's left side. The old man swallowed. No shelter dog should know that whistle. No retired canine should respond to that code. Something was wrong. Or something had always been wrong. It was late afternoon when the call came crackling through an old landline mounted on the kitchen wall, its cord twisted and stained by years of coffee-stained hands. Eldon stood beside it, the receiver heavy in his palm. On the other end was a woman from the Department of Defense Archives, her voice clipped, efficient and unwilling to linger. "Yes, Mr. McCrae, we located your request. You were listed as the former primary handler for K9 Operative Ranger, ID code R7421. Official status, deceased in field operation. Incident explosion at Checkpoint Victor. Body unrecovered due to structural collapse. Deemed non-recoverable. Flag and medal issued posthumously." Eldon didn't reply right away. The words washed over him like distant thunder. "Any chance," he said slowly, "that identification could have been wrong?" There was a pause. "We rely on field reporting, sir. Identification was made by unit log, not physical confirmation. There are occasional errors." He hung up not long after, stood in the silent kitchen with a hand pressed flat to the table. Outside, the wind picked up through the pines, brushing against the cabin like a memory. Finch lay by the door, head on his paws, amber eyes watching. Eldon stepped outside and sat on the porch step, letting the cold boards bite through his jeans. He stared at the mountains. Then slowly he turned toward the dog. Ranger. The name came out like a breath. Finch lifted his head instantly. His tail thumped the porch once. Ranger Eldon said again, firmer this time. This time the dog stood. He walked over slowly, deliberately. When he reached Eldon, he pressed his head against the old man's chest and let out a low, shuddering breath. Eldon's fingers dug into the thick fur eyes, burning. 7 years of silence. 7 years of believing he'd buried more than just a collar. And now, here he was alive, changed, but the same. Later that night, the storm came. It wasn't in the forecast, but that didn't matter in Granite Hollow. The sky had turned to slate by dusk, and by 10 the trees were bending under sharp mountain winds. Rain pounded the tin roof like 1,000 impatient fists. Eldon had just settled into his worn leather armchair when there was a knock. No, not a knock. A scratching. Urgent, low. He opened the front door to find Ranger, no longer Finch, pacing on the porch, wet and agitated eyes darting toward the tree line. "What is it, boy?" The dog bolted. No hesitation. Eldon grabbed his flashlight, shrugged into his coat, and followed without question. The beam of light bounced over puddles and shadows, Ranger's golden coat flashing through the dark like a beacon. They crossed the gravel path, past the Quinn house, dark and quiet. Eldon stopped to scan the windows. No light. Ranger paused only to sniff the air, then darted left down the wooded path that ran behind the property. 10 minutes later, Eldon heard it. A cry, soft, scared, caught between wind gusts and the whipping of branches. Maisie, he called, already knowing. There, tucked between a thicket of bramble and wet ferns, was the small frame of Maisie Quinn, curled beneath an overturned wheelbarrow, her hoodie-soaked boots lost. Her face was streaked with mud tears, barely visible under the rain. She didn't scream. She just looked up and whispered, "I didn't want to go." Eldon knelt beside her, his heart hammering. Ranger pushed close to her side, licking her cheek, nudging her shoulder as if counting her breaths. Didn't want to go where Eldon asked. Maisie sniffled. The state lady came. Said they might put me somewhere else. I didn't want to go to a group place. They're loud. I don't like loud. Her hands were trembling. She had always been quiet, always small, always alone. Eldon didn't ask more. He lifted her gently, one arm under her knees, the other behind her shoulders. She didn't resist. Ranger stayed at his side all the way back, tail low, glancing back every few steps. At the cabin, Eldon dried her off, gave her one of his old flannel shirts and thick socks that sagged around her ankles. She sat on the couch with a mug of warm broth and a towel wrapped around her like armor. Ranger lay in front of her, his head resting on her feet, not moving even as the fire popped. "She's scared," Eldon said more to the flames than to himself. And then, as if answering, Ranger looked up at him with those knowing eyes that had once stood beside him in desert towns and fractured cities. That night, Maisie slept on the pull-out cot by the wood stove, and Ranger never left her side. Eldon stood at the window, the storm fading into mist, the sky now a soft blur of bruised gray and pink. A name had returned to him, and with it a past that refused to stay buried. The morning sun cast a faded orange over Granite Hollow, glinting off dew-soaked pine needles and curling steam from Eldon's chipped coffee mug. The storm had passed, but its memory still lingered in broken branches, puddles in the dirt road, and the quiet heaviness in Eldon's chest. Ranger was asleep on the porch, paws twitching slightly as he dreamed. Maisie, wrapped in a worn flannel shirt, sat cross-legged beside him, sketching quietly in a spiral notebook with stubby colored pencils. Eldon watched them from the kitchen window. In that still moment it struck him that neither of them truly belonged to this Time Ranger with his half-erased history, and Maisie with her wide, silent eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. But some truths don't stay buried. Eldon had made up his mind the night before. There was a facility, an old military training ground near Redwater Ridge, 4 hours northeast. He remembered the name from a conversation with an old contact years ago, long before he ever thought it might matter. If Ranger had been moved, reclassified, repurposed Redwater Ridge would be the place. He left a note on the table for Maisie, promising he'd be back by nightfall. She didn't say much when he told her he had to drive out for the day. Just nodded, petted Ranger once, and returned to her drawing. He packed a thermos of coffee and a ham sandwich, then left with a glance back at the cabin where the world seemed quieter than it deserved to be. The drive to Redwater Ridge was long and uphill, winding through high plains and steep switchbacks. The further Eldon drove, the more the forest thinned, giving way to bare hills and silent valleys. The facility, when he reached it, looked more like a forgotten ghost than a place where anything important had ever happened. Barbed wire fencing surrounded squat concrete buildings with shuttered windows and rusted gates. A lone truck was parked near the main building, its white paint dulled by time. Eldon got out slowly, scanning for movement. Then the door opened and Cal Whitmore stepped out. Cal was a man in his late 50s, tall but slouched from years behind a desk with hair like worn straw and a limp in his left leg. He wore a military surplus jacket 2 sizes too large, and a Vietnam vet cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was lined deep, but his eyes were sharp gray and knowing. McCrae Cal asked, his voice hoarse from years of chewing tobacco and dry mountain air. "Yeah," Eldon said, "you're Whitmore." "That's right. I was told you might have records. About a K-9 unit from Frostline IDR 7421. Cal's mouth tightened. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and gestured for Eldon to follow him inside. The hallway was dim and smelled of mold and old varnish. Filing cabinets lined the walls and dust floated in shafts of light from cracked windows. Cal pulled out a metal drawer and slid out a folder thick and stamped with a faded restricted label. He laid it on the table and flipped it open. Dog came through here, Ranger. Transferred from field service after injury. They brought him in under the Neural Recalibration Initiative. Eldon's eyebrows furrowed. "What the hell is that experimental program?" Cal muttered, flipping through the files. Idea was to retrain damaged service animals, reprogram instinct, suppress trauma responses, extend usability. It didn't work, not really. Eldon stared at the folder. Paper-clipped reports described a repeated failure to respond, agitation, non-compliance, but also underlined and circled memory override unsuccessful. "They tried to wipe him," Eldon said quietly. "Didn't take Cal confirmed. They gave up. Dog got sent to surplus. No name, no records, just dumped into civilian resale, so they sold him. Not directly," Cal shrugged. "Contracted out to a handler group. Third-party auction channels. Legal, but shady as hell." "Who signed off on it?" Cal hesitated. Then he flipped to the back page and slid it over. Eldon read the name Captain Reese Donnellan. The name hit him like a stone. Donnellan had been a field commander in Ranger's original unit, brilliant, politically protected, and morally flexible. Eldon had clashed with him more than once over tactics that pushed dogs past their limits. Cal leaned back in his chair. "He's got a ranch out near Winterledge, real private. Big gates, bigger secrets." Eldon folded the papers, carefully slipping them into his jacket. "Thanks," he said. "I never saw you," Cal replied. "And you never got those." Eldon left the facility with the wind pushing hard against his back. As he drove, the sun sank behind the hills, lighting the sky with copper and purple. Back at the cabin, Maisie sat on the porch swing holding a paper plate with a slice of toast and peanut butter. Ranger lay nearby, still and watchful. Earlier that afternoon, Jack Quinn had returned. Maisie's father was a man in his late 30s with sun-dark skin and work-calloused hands. His hair was always hidden under a beanie, and his face carried a tired edge that rarely softened. He didn't yell much, but he didn't listen much either. When he came back from jobs, he stayed in his room with the curtains drawn and bottles lined up on the floor. But this time, things were different. Eldon had left him a note too, a short one. She almost died in the woods last night. We're all getting older. Be the man she thinks you are. Jack hadn't responded with words, but he did sit with Maisie for breakfast. He didn't leave again that day. That evening, when Eldon returned, he found them in the yard. Jack was helping Maisie tie the laces on a too big pair of hiking boots. The air between them felt different, not healed, but hopeful. Ranger walked up to Eldon and leaned against his side. Eldon looked down at him, then up at the man and girl before him. Sometimes a dog didn't just save a person. Sometimes he saved a family. The air in Granite Hollow had shifted. It wasn't just the scent of late autumn burnt pine-cold soil and the lingering smoke of distant chimneys. It was something else, something quieter. Word had spread, not like wildfire, but like morning frost across old windows, soft, unannounced, but undeniable. People whispered about Eldon McCrae and the dog who'd come back from the dead. It started with Sarah Trent, the postmaster, a tall, spare woman in her early 60s with cropped silver hair and a long, measured gait. Sarah had always been blunt, the kind of person who never sugar-coated bad news, but still brought soup when someone lost a spouse. She had known Eldon for decades, watched him retreat from town after the military after the supposed loss of Ranger. When she saw Eldon walk in that Tuesday morning with Ranger sitting obediently outside the door, she froze. That dog looks like she began. He is, Eldon said simply, setting down a manila envelope addressed to a federal oversight office. Sarah's eyes flicked between Eldon and the dog, and for once she had no words. Then she stepped outside, knelt, and placed her hand on Ranger's head. "Welcome home, soldier," she whispered. It was the beginning of something larger than either of them expected. By Friday, Eldon's story had made it to the Granite Ledger, the town's twice-a-month print paper. A column written by Marta Kingsley, a part-time journalist and full-time school librarian, gave a gentle factual retelling of Ranger's journey. A dog declared dead, rediscovered at auction, and returned to the man he once called his own. Marta, a petite redhead with thick glasses and a soft spot for underdogs, had cried while writing it, though she'd deny it to anyone who asked. The piece ended with a line that would be repeated in grocery stores and barber shops for weeks. Sometimes loyalty doesn't die. It just waits until someone's brave enough to find it again. By the following week, Eldon received a letter. It bore the seal of the Federal Canine Welfare Oversight Division, and its language was stiff and formal, but the meaning was clear. The canine formerly registered as R7421 was to be released from all prior classifications and assigned to the care of Eldon McCrae as his permanent legal guardian. All attempted memory reclassification was to be noted as failed, and the entity Ranger recognized as a dog with full behavioral integrity and rights to protection. Eldon folded the letter carefully and set it on the mantel beside the old photograph he'd once tucked away himself in uniform, and a younger Ranger at his side, both of them looking slightly toward a future that neither of them could have predicted. That night, Eldon walked into the living room and found Maisie asleep on the couch, her arms wrapped around Ranger like he was a lifeline. She'd started spending more time at the cabin since her father, Jack Quinn, had begun fixing things around their own home, installing window locks, repairing the back step, cooking actual meals. Their bond was still fragile, but it was growing roots, and Eldon wasn't about to interfere with something finally blooming in the right direction. He let her sleep, covered her with a knitted blanket, and sat in the chair across from them. Ranger opened one eye and gave a low, contented huff, as if to say, "We're home." But the story didn't quite end there. One afternoon, a letter arrived without a return address. Inside was a single sheet typed. He was never meant to make it out. You were never meant to find him. Keep your head low. Not everyone's happy he's still breathing. There was no signature, no proof. Just threat folded in silence. Eldon stared at the paper for a long time, then fed it to the fireplace. He had lived enough years to know that justice rarely moved as fast as cruelty, but this time he had a town behind him, a story that wouldn't go quiet, and a dog that had survived every attempt to silence him. Later that week, Ranger trotted into the general store with Eldon, tail wagging lightly, ears perked. A little boy near the register gasped, ran forward and hugged him before anyone could stop him. "You're the brave dog," the boy said. Ranger nuzzled his shoulder gently. Eldon looked down and smiled. "He's just a dog," he said, "who never forgot where he belonged." That night, in the golden hush of the porch light, Eldon sat on the steps, Maisie beside him, Ranger between them. "You think he remembers everything?" Maisie asked quietly. "I think Eldon said he remembers what matters." The moon rose above the pines, cold and clear, and for the first time in years, the old man, the girl who once had no voice, and the dog who returned from the edge sat without ghosts between them. Sometimes what seems lost forever isn't gone, it's just waiting for the right moment, the right heart, and the right kind of faith to bring it back. Ranger wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that love, loyalty, and healing don't disappear. They endure quietly, patiently, until God opens a door no man can close. Maybe you're facing something right now that feels like it's over a relationship, a dream, or even a part of yourself. But just like Ranger found his way home, what was meant for you will never truly leave you. God works in silence and shadows, and even in forgotten places to write stories of redemption that no one saw coming. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, or simply type "Amen" if you believe that miracles still happen and that God never forgets those who wait. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story of faith, love, and the amazing bond between animals and people. May God bless you and those you love. And may He bring home everything your heart has been waiting for.